Welcome back to another off-season edition of Straight Outta Flushing. And, well, it's almost a wrap for the off-season. Spring training is right around the corner. And for the Mets, the questions, they're louder than ever. After a busy and sometimes I would say controversial offseason, David Stearns, he's put his stamp on this roster. Look, they've made some big moves. They've taken some risks. They bet on both stars and youth. But now it's time to ask the real question. Is this a roster built to win in 2026, or is there still work to do? Joining me now to break it all down and joining me for the first time on the show is Mets content creator. He's a big Mets fan, a huge creator in the digital space. You know him. His name is Tony Metro. Does a fantastic job. My guy Tony joins me now. Tony, what's going on, man? How you doing?
Dex, great to be here. You said it perfectly. Busy, sometimes controversial offseason here for the Mets, but one that I think has put them in a position where we're going to be excited about what we see on the field here in just a couple of weeks, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
See, that is good for me to hear, because you had me on your wonderful show, I don't know, that was maybe over a month ago, and I think I would say the vibes were a lot different around Mets fans at that time. It's shifted a little bit. A lot has happened since then. So let's start with this, Tony, because with spring training less than a little bit over a week away, so we're less than 2 weeks away from this. When you look at this Mets offseason in totality, how would you grade the Mets offseason as a whole, and did they do enough to move the needle for you? What do you say about this Mets offseason? What's your grade?
Yeah, well, obviously one that has been a bit tumultuous. The beginning, I would even say, has felt like two different off seasons. Very difficult in the beginning, of course, losing some fan favorites in Pete Alonso, Edwin Diaz departing for the Dodgers, Brandon Nimmo being traded. But in totality, I would give it a B plus. Now, I can't give an A, and I'll reveal why at the end of my answer here. But I felt like they've made some really smart additions. Not necessarily the splashiest, or maybe even the ones that fans wanted, but you add in Bichette, one of the best bat to ball hitters in all of baseball. You bring in Devin Williams, Luke Weaver to hopefully replace what you were getting out of Edwin Diaz over the last several years. And then some of the more low-key additions in Jorge Polanco and Marcus Semien, the trade for Luis Robert Jr., all that without mentioning they did add the ace in Freddy Peralta in that trade just about a week and a half ago. And it's hard to not feel positive about the direction that the Mets are heading in. So I give them a B plus. The reason I can't give them an A is because of how that Edwin Diaz situation went down. It sounds like it might have been just a mere few $1 million that the Dodgers outbid the Mets on to retain or acquire his services. And so not only is it difficult to watch Diaz leave, but of course, David Stearns has no control of where his players and free agents end up signing. But the fact that he went to the team that has now won back-to-back World Series, clearly the best team in not only the National League, but in all of baseball in the LA Dodgers. It's hard for me to give the Mets better than a B plus, but still a really solid offseason, one that I think that they have put themselves in a position to get back to postseason contention.
Yeah, I think B plus is more than a fair grade. Look, I thought losing Edwin Diaz was much more of a blow than losing Pete Alonso. So I agree with you. And I think when you lose what I would say is the best closer in the game, he goes to the World Series champions. Yeah, hard to give him an A. I think B plus is pretty fair. Now, I'm not sure where Mets fans would have had it in terms of a grade 5-6 weeks ago, but maybe they would have been at a C. But I think they're at a B plus. So, Tony, when you look at this roster on paper right now, what do you think is the biggest upgrade from last season? That's one part of the question. Then, what's also the biggest remaining concern that you have with this team?
That's a good question. I actually don't think there's a specific position that is the biggest upgrade for this team, but I would say the lineup as a whole. Now, at the outset, you lose Pete Alonso, 38 to 40 home run bat on a year-to-year basis. But I think they're going to be more dynamic than they have been in years past with that former core that they had of him and Nimmo and Jeff McNeil to a degree. I feel like David Stearns has built a team, and he actually just said it as recently, I believe it was a week ago, of how they don't want to quote unquote give away at bats the entire season. Now, I don't think that was him ripping the 2025 team, but you look at Polanco, you look at Simeon, you look at Bichette and their strikeout rates. They're in the top 80th percentile and even higher as far as strikeout rates, K rate, and not giving away at bats, so to say. So they're trying to win, obviously, still, but in a different way from what we were accustomed to, where it felt like Pete Alonso needed to come up and hit a big 3-run homer, or even in 2024, the same for Mark Vientos before his rough season in 2025. So I think the biggest improvement is this lineup in the fact that it's going to be relentless. It is going to be similar or akin to what we saw from the Toronto Blue Jays this past year on their march to Game 7 of the World Series, where it just felt they were always putting the ball in play, always putting pressure on the opposing pitching staff and defenses. So that's what I think is the biggest upgrade. My biggest concern, and I think that most fans probably feel this way still as well, is the starting rotation. They did good to bring in Freddy Peralta, a guy that you hope will continue to pitch like an ace or a top of the rotation guy. You have Nolan McLean, who you hope takes steps forward in his second year, but there are still some big question marks with the veterans that are returning from that group last year. So until proven otherwise, I think the biggest concern you have to have about this Mets group heading into 2026 is the starting rotation.
I think that's more than fair, and we're going to get into both the lineup and rotation as we look at those, how they look going into this season. But let me get back to David Stearns, because I think after the Mets lost Edwin Diaz, after they lost Pete Alonso, there was a lot of pressure on David Stearns. You could argue that there was more pressure on him than anybody else in baseball in terms of getting their roster together. So do you think David Stearns executed his long-term plan this winter, or do you look at it that he had to pivot based on the market and the players he lost? And did he do a good job in pivoting, if that's the way you look at it?
Yeah, no, I think the Mets front office and David Stearns had an idea of the profile of the type of players that they wanted to add to this roster. They had a good idea of what they were lacking last year and what they needed to remove and also add to the 2026 Mets team. I think it's a little bit of a blend of both, where they had that strategy and they executed it on a couple of different players. I think Jorge Polanco is someone that they identified early on, and we saw that with the Mets signing him shortly after Pete Alonso departed for Baltimore. But one thing that has rang true since David Stearns became the president of baseball operations for this organization, since Steve Cohen, his stewardship began as the owner of the Mets, is that they will be opportunistic when the opportunity presents itself. We saw that in the case of Kyle Tucker, where he came into this offseason seeking a 10-year deal for $400 million. His market did not play out that way. And the Mets entered the conversation with the high average annual value offer, which unfortunately he did end up taking with the Los Angeles Dodgers. But the Mets, with maybe 12 hours to spare in between, were able to pivot and sign Bo Bichette. So they have shown a willingness to adapt and change their plans as the market changes itself. And that is something that, as a baseball fan, as a sports fan, you have to be so happy and pleased with, from the people that run the team and of course from the owner, for having that financial willingness and flexibility to allow them to do so.
And look, Tony, you know this as a lifelong Mets fan. You haven't always seen flexibility and adaptability with previous ownership or previous front office groups. So it is something nice for the Mets to have here. So I want us to do this. Let's really look at this roster, and I want to start with the lineup. How do you feel about the projected everyday batting order heading into camp? Because as you mentioned earlier, it's a lot different looking than it was last year. And you used the word dynamic. You think it could be more dynamic, right? You're losing some of that power that you had from Pete Alonso there in the lineup. You're losing that from Brandon Nimmo as well, too. But how are you feeling about this projected everyday batting order as we head into camp?
Yeah, I'm feeling very good and positive about it. And I think that this lineup will be as good, if not better, than the one that we saw in 2025. I think we entered last year, of course, coming off of the second half and postseason run of Mark Vientos, as your everyday third baseman that was going to be a perennial 30 home run bat and maybe even get better than that. Obviously, that's not how things broke for them last year, but we did get the emergence of Brett Beatty in the second half. But putting all of that to the side of what they're retaining and bringing back talent-wise, they also bring in Bichette. And I think that when you look at the top three in the order, we heard Mendoza say a couple of days ago on a podcast that he envisions it being Lindor, Soto, Bichette at the top. That is about as dynamic and great of a top three in the order as any in all of Major League Baseball. So that is very exciting. The prospect of having two high OBP guys in Lindor and Soto, and Bo Bichette, who has been one of the best hitters with runners in scoring position since he debuted about 6 years ago. And that was one of the big things I want to key in on. Jorge Polanco himself is no slouch with runners in scoring position, has a career 337 average, 400 average with runners in scoring position, and has been one of the best guys at driving runs in. I look at Marcus Semien, and a lot of people have basically said he's here just purely because he's a Gold Glover at second base, but not too long ago was easily one of, if not the best hitting second baseman in all of baseball after transitioning from shortstop earlier in his career. And not that people want to hear this, but he is going from what was determined to be the third worst hitters park out in Arlington, Globe Life Park, to one that is a lot more favorable in Citi Field, especially to right-handed pull hitters. And that is who Marcus Semien is. So I expect Marcus Semien to have a bounce back at the plate based on what we have seen in recent years. And then I think the biggest wild card in this lineup either being really good and truly great is Luis Robert Jr. If Robert Jr. hits closer to the way he did in 2023 when he had 38 home runs, nearly 100 RBIs, and was in the MVP conversation, this lineup can go from really good to you do not want to face it if you're an opposing pitching staff, because there are just no breaks 1 through 9.
Huge X factor in this lineup. It'll be interesting to see with him. You and I talked about this on your show. Francisco Alvarez, does he take that next step? I think he can be huge for this Mets team in this lineup. But I want to focus back on Bo Bichette because he is, I mean, look, he's a major addition for this team in terms of everyday players. And I'll add, somewhat surprising addition this winter because I think coming off of the Kyle Tucker sweepstakes and the Mets losing out on that, not many people saw this team pivoting that quickly to Bo Bichette. So when you look at Bichette, how much does he change the ceiling of this offense just by being there, possibly being in that top three, a guy with a high on-base percentage, a guy who can drive in runs really well, hits well with 2 strikes? How much does he change the ceiling of this offense, Tony?
Yeah, he was a necessity, Dex. I mean, to not have Bo in this lineup, I mean, let's be honest. If you look at this lineup on paper without Bo Bichette, it doesn't really intimidate you, right? It doesn't exactly strike the fear of, just making opposing pitching staffs be worried about too many guys in this order. But I think when you add Bo Bichette in, and I won't say he's the quote unquote Reggie Jackson straw that stirs the drink, but you add him in. And again, like I said before, one of the top 1, 2, 3 in all of baseball with him and Lindor and with Soto. And again, it was a necessity to have this kind of guy, a guy that has hit for over a 300 average last year and 94 RBIs. I won't say that this is the best lineup in baseball yet, but I think with him in it and with those other factors that I mentioned in Robert Jr. and Marcus Semien having a bounce back, and with Jorge Polanco shooting for 20 to 28 home runs again, like he did last season in Seattle, they have the potential to, at some point in this season, be viewed that way. But you don't get there without also having Bo Bichette right smack dab in the middle of it all.
There you go. Bo Bichette as a necessity for this lineup. I think he's going to fit in really good here for the Mets. A guy who's going to try to fit in and heading into spring training, it appears that Carson Benge is getting a real opportunity to play in the outfield, likely in left field, now with Luis Robert Jr. coming over. What does that say about how the organization views his development, considering everything that we've heard is that he's going to get a real shot to play in the outfield and try to earn a spot in this roster coming out of camp. What does it say about that?
Yeah, well, this was David Stearns' first pick as the president of baseball operations for the Mets back in the 2023 draft, 24, excuse me. And so came out of Oklahoma State, which is, of course, a hotbed for talent. Plenty of major leaguers around the league, including his teammate at the top of the rotation in Nolan McLean. So this is a guy that has been on the fast track to the majors and has done nothing but impress and just hit the cover off the ball in all the different levels of the minor leagues. We talked about Brandon Nimmo just a little bit, but I want to tie him into this conversation. And I believe Carson Benge's trajectory in the minor leagues and the idea of him coming up and having an impact on the team in 2026 had a lot to do with the Mets feeling like they were ready to trade Brandon Nimmo. We know that a big reason why was because of how much money and how many more years were remaining on his contract. But I think you don't make that trade without knowing that there is a younger and cheaper player that might even be better waiting in the wings, and that is Carson Benge. And from everything we have heard, it sounds like he's almost actually a perfect blend of the two versions that we have seen of Brandon Nimmo. The one that we saw early in his career where he was that high on base percentage guy with an elite eye at the plate that could have a 400 on base percentage, didn't hit for a lot of power, but then here in the last 2 or 3 years started to cater more to the home run department, more in the 20 to 25 range. It sounds like Carson Benge is a perfect blend of both of those versions of Brandon Nimmo. He's one of 3 players in the minor leagues this past year to have 15 plus home runs, 20 plus stolen bases, and a 150 weighted runs created plus to go with a K percentage below 20%. So Benge sounds like a guy that could be an above average, even award-winning left fielder that doesn't strike out a lot, gets on base a lot, and oh, by the way, also has power. It's a really exciting prospect to see him having his debut here in Queens in 2026.
Yeah, what excites me a lot about that and all the numbers you said was like the strikeout rate is down for me. That's a lot. And the fact that if he does get on base, he does have some speed. And when you look at this Mets lineup, use the word dynamic. I'm going to come back to that word because it looks like they could play more in a way that I personally like to watch as a baseball fan, right? Can you manufacture runs in different ways? Can you create havoc on the base path? That's something I like to see a little bit more. So they've got a little bit more versatility, and Carson Benge could be a huge part of that. Okay, Tony, let's go over to the pitching because you said earlier that this was where you still had some concern about this team. You feel like most of the fan base does, and I would be inclined to agree. So how are you feeling about this rotation as currently constructed, and do you believe that it is a true contending staff? What do you say about this rotation?
Adding Freddy Peralta has quelled a lot of the fears that I think we had the majority of this offseason up until last week. But a contending staff, I think there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. And does it become one of the top 5, top 10 staffs in baseball by June? That's a very real possibility. But I think it depends on a lot of factors. The biggest being the veterans from last year. How does Sean Manaea look? Do we get Sean Manaea from the second half of 2024, or do we get the one from 2025 whose season really never got underway? David Peterson, do we see the all-star first half of 2025, or do we see the one at the end of the season, August and September, where it seemed like he just kind of ran out of gas? And then, of course, Kodai Senga, I talked about X Factor with Luis Robert Jr. for the position players, but how does Kodai Senga look? Of course, was brilliant for his first 13 starts until the hamstring injury covering first base. Does he look like the guy that we saw in the first half of 2025, or the one that couldn't seem to get his mechanics right and didn't feel right physically and obviously was almost unpitchable by the end of the season? So I think those questions all need to be answered before I'm ready to say this is, a true contending staff. You can feel really good about Freddy Peralta. You can feel really good about Nolan McLean in year 2, but it's a 5-man pitching staff, maybe even 6-man rotation if Kodai Senga is a part of it, trying to accommodate him. And those are questions that I think we need to get answers to early on in the year before I'm ready to say it's one of the best in the league.
Yeah, and there are a lot of questions. You just brought up a lot of fair questions with the rotation, and we'll see what the answers are to those questions. I think I'll say this: if those questions are answered positively, the rotation could look a lot better. You could feel a lot better about it than you would initially, but still a ways to go. So we'll see about this. You mentioned Freddy Peralta. That being the huge boost to this rotation. They needed a frontline starter. What's your expectation for him in this Mets system, and do you believe that he can take another step forward as a starter?
I'll answer that by saying I think it's hard to ask for anything more than what he did last season. It was a career year for Peralta with the Brewers last year. And like you said, the Mets needed an ace. And hopefully that is what they're trading for, a 2.70 ERA over 33 starts, an ERA plus of 154, which, for those that don't care about these new age analytics, basically just means 54% better than the league average starting pitcher. So in the upper echelon of any starters in all of Major League Baseball last year, he's consistently been one of the top arms in the game. And so if he can provide that, my goodness, the Mets are going to be in a really good spot with a 1-2 punch of him and McLean at the top of this rotation. Overall, I think the one thing that a lot of Mets fans, now that they learned about the trade and have looked deeper into Peralta's numbers, are he doesn't go deep into games. He doesn't really go past 5 or past 6 innings. That's what I've seen a lot of online and a lot of people that have commented on my videos and stuff lately. That was more an organizational philosophy that the Milwaukee Brewers employed to try to get the best possible pitching matchups, to also take advantage of a very, very good bullpen last year. So I wouldn't look too deep into that. I think that if the opportunity presents itself for Peralta to pitch into the 7th, to pitch into the 8th, even something that's unheard of nowadays, that he will do so. He did acknowledge it at his press conference, his introductory Zoom meeting just last week. And so he is a high strikeout guy. Maybe he pitches a little more to contact, so we can go deeper into games. But that might be the only one little thing you could potentially nitpick about Freddy Peralta. But all things being said, we are talking about one of the top 20 pitchers in baseball, something the Mets sorely lacked last year, a stopper. And it should be very exciting to see him suit up in the orange and blue.
Real quick follow-up to that, Tony, about the nitpicking that people have done with Peralta, is him not going deep into games. I think he averaged 5.3 innings per start last season. Do the Mets need him to go deeper into that? Would you feel better if his average innings per start is 6+? Is that something they need out of him this season?
It's a good question. We haven't touched on the bullpen yet.
Yeah, we will.
I think it is dependent on how a bullpen is managed by both the manager and as an organization. It's good to have a guy that can give you 6-7 innings, give the bullpen a night off. 7 is probably closer to giving a bullpen the night off.
Yeah,
that also comes with how many runs does your lineup put up? Do they consistently put up a 5 or a 6 spot for you? And if that's the case, well, then maybe you don't need to push Peralta that deep, because you hopefully have your eye toward October, toward a deep postseason run. So I never get too bogged down with how many innings a starter gives you on a nightly basis. More so, how do they look and how are they trending toward a hopeful postseason run?
Yeah, that's the most. If you have aspirations of a deep postseason run, that is the most important thing. You're right. There's a lot of factors in judging instead of just solely looking at numbers. This is why you have to factor in everything when you look at that. Last thing on the pitching, what would you say is the biggest risk factor with this pitching staff as currently assembled? Is it that you don't know what you're getting from a bunch of guys, right? Is it maybe depth? There's a lot of options you can go here, but what do you look as the biggest risk factor with this pitching staff?
I do think it is the veterans that I had mentioned before, in Senga and Peterson and Sean Manaea. I actually feel pretty good about the depth. Obviously, Brandon Sprout is now out of the picture, having been traded to Milwaukee in the Peralta deal. But I think Jonah Tong is going to be a guy that is going to start the year in AAA, but is going to be someone that they call upon when they're ready to insert him into the rotation for the long haul. I know they want to see Tong develop a third pitch, maybe a sweeper, maybe a slider, something to complement the fastball curveball mix that he has right now. But I think you have him waiting in the wings. I think Tobias Myers is a guy with a lot of starter experience that will probably begin the year in the bullpen, but also could be used as a swingman at times, depending on the schedule and the health of the rotation. So I feel good about the depth, and overall, I think it really just does depend on what versions of those veterans that we're going to get. And I didn't touch on Clay Holmes. He had a really solid year in his first season transitioning from closer to starter. Obviously, there were some bumps in the road there around August where he was really struggling to get past the fifth inning and giving up some crooked numbers early on in games. But you look at it at the end, totality, a 3.51 ERA, took the ball every fifth day. Do we get that again from Clay Holmes as well? I think if even just two of those four names right there hit, and you get what you're expecting from Peralta and you get what you're expecting, hopefully, from Nolan McLean, you're going to feel pretty good about this rotation when you also sprinkle in the starts that you might get from Tong, from Myers, maybe even from Christian Scott, now a kind of forgotten prospect who was formerly a top 5 member of this farm system that is now coming back from Tommy John surgery. And I think you blend it all together and you should feel pretty good about this group.
Yeah, I think sometimes we do forget about Christian Scott. I had Nick Pollock on here a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned how he still thinks Christian Scott can be very impactful for this Mets pitching staff going forward. You know, obviously you got to see how he comes back from the Tommy John surgery and all that, but he said that's a guy I would still watch on, and he likes his stuff, so we'll see that. All right, let's talk about the bullpen because, you know, interesting offseason bullpen moves, I will say, especially after losing Edwin Diaz. So how do you evaluate the bullpen after this offseason? Is it better? Is it worse? Or is it just different?
I think different is the perfect word, actually. I really do. And I got to give you credit, Dex, because you said on my show, it is so crucial that Devin Williams gets off to a good start.
Oh,
obviously, I mean, probably the most unenviable position in baseball right now to replace a fan favorite and who was, if not the top closer in baseball, among the top in Edwin Diaz. And so we saw what he did in the Bronx this past season, and it was a bit up and down. I'd say more down than up, though he trended in an upward direction in the final couple months there. So there are some questions about whether he can, quote unquote, handle New York, whether he's fit for this. And so I think that is important. You added Luke Weaver, who had some really good years with the crosstown rivals as well, but was not so great this past season, was borderline unpitchable by the time that team was in their postseason run in October. So hopefully those two guys can hold down the fort. Also, questions about the two lefties in this pen. AJ Minter missed virtually all of last season after having the torn lat from May on through the end of the year. How does he recover now at 32, almost 33 years old? And then the same for Brooks Raley, who was one of the few players on this team that I graded out with an A for their 2025 season, albeit a very short one. He pitched 25 innings and for the most part was the most trustworthy arm you could trust out of the Mets bullpen last year toward the second half, toward the stretch. That's great and all, but he was just coming off of Tommy John surgery. He turns 38 years old in the middle of this year. Do we get those same results from him? So I definitely think it's different, to answer your question. And I'm hoping that they can still be solid, but there are some questions in there without a doubt.
I think the thing for me is you lost the guy you trust the most in Edwin Diaz. You talked about Raley, but only 25 innings, so small sample size for him last season. Though he was fantastic in the time we saw him out there. Then you're bringing in guys, you know, for the team that plays in the Bronx, that didn't pitch so well for them, and they've got a lot. They've got a lot to prove. So, the bullpen feels, Tony, like it's still not settled. But it's going, we know this, it's going to be really important. And I will say this again here, as I said on your show, Devin Williams better get off to a good start, because if he does not, man, oh man, the fans in Citi Field are going to be booing. I work with a bunch of Yankee fans here at the Post, and they're already telling me, Dex, it's not going to be good. I get where they're coming from, but we can only hope. We can only hope. We can only hope. So
yeah, and if I may just,
go ahead.
I think there are some interesting arms coming up through the Mets system as well. We've heard so much about how vaunted this Mets farm system is. And one of them that we didn't actually see at the end of last year, but was called up and potentially was going to start game 162 in Miami was Dylan Ross.
Yeah, Dylan Ross.
He's a guy that has a big league splitter, a guy that has, went through the ranks of the minors and has proven that he's ready for the big league stage. And he's someone I think is going to come up and be a huge part of this relief corps. There's Lambert, who's another name that I wouldn't be surprised to see have a big impact in this bullpen at some point this year. So I think the Mets, and we heard this from Will Salmon, of course, we know a great writer for The Athletic. The Mets didn't feel they had a lot of flexibility last year in terms of optionable players, optionable arms in their bullpen. And so we continued to have these pitchers kind of, picked up, not to be disrespectful, but off the scrap heap, guys that maybe didn't have a job at the moment, but had big league experience. I don't think that's going to be the case here in 2026. I think we're going to have a lot of proven MLB arms and guys that are coming up from the minors that have proven themselves down in the lower levels of the system that are ready now to emerge and have an impact on this team.
No, that's a great point, and it's going to be huge for the Mets. And what we saw, not last year, because you had the point, the Mets didn't have that flexibility, but even in 2024, you saw from David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza, hey, okay, and this was even for position players. If a guy's not working out, we'll make this thing work. We'll move in somebody else. We'll bring somebody else in. I've always liked that. Holds guys to a standard to be able to perform, and we'll see how that happens with the bullpen. A couple more things for you, Tony. We've seen, I'm sure you've seen this too, there's various projections and standings models for this Mets team heading into the season. Some I've seen have had the Mets, as a playoff team, some third in the NL East. Do you think overall, when you look at these, they're fair to the Mets, or do you think they are underrating this Mets team right now?
I think everything I have seen has been a very fair assessment.
Okay.
All of the projections that I have seen have been in the high 80s, low 90s, either right in front or right behind the Phillies, or in some cases with the Braves in between all of them. So I think that's a very fair grade. Look, like I said before, it may not have been the sexiest, most splashiest offseason, because we're here in New York. We don't necessarily know who Jorge Polanco is because he was the second baseman for the Seattle Mariners, right? But he's a guy that hit 26 home runs last year. He's a guy that had an OPS over 800, as good, if not better than Brandon Nimmo's last season. Someone that hits with runners in scoring position. So he's someone that, maybe we didn't have a lot of awareness about, but that the people that make these projections, they definitely know Jorge Polanco. Of course we know Bo Bichette. Of course we know Freddy Peralta. We've heard Luis Robert Jr. and the potential that he has, untapped or otherwise. So I think these are fair projections. I think that Stearns has had, like we said, a bit of a tumultuous offseason for this front office, with some fan favorites leaving and with a lot of reaction from the fan base. But in totality here, now we stand here just a few weeks from spring training. I think this is a team that is going to compete for the division title. And at worst, should be competing for one of those three wild card spots. So I think you have to be feeling really positive based on what those projections are putting out right now.
All right, so you say you have to be feeling really positive. I guess we'll leave it on this. We're going to try to look a little bit big picture. So based on this roster and everything that we just talked about, Tony, this whole offseason, how it's gone, the direction that David Stearns has taken as he's tried to mold this team into the team that he would like to see out there on the field. In your eyes, what does a successful 2026 season look like for the Mets? What would really define success after, I think, what you and I would both agree was a very disappointing 2025 season? So what does success look like for the Mets here in 2026?
Well, I'll say this. There's no two ways about it. The Mets need to make the playoffs in 2026. They cannot afford to miss the postseason for a second consecutive year, coming off of the just awful collapse they had in 2025. So a successful season for me would be to either get to the NLCS or the World Series. But there's a bar, there's a minimum of making the playoffs. They have been one of the perennial top 2 spenders in all Major League Baseball since Steve Cohen acquired the team. There doesn't seem to be any end of that in sight. And so there's no one that's going to, write you a, positive feeling kind of message for missing the playoffs by a game or by 2 games when you are consistently having a payroll of $350 million or larger. So for me, the bare minimum is for the Mets to make the playoffs in 2026. If they miss it this year, it's going to be a very concerning future for this organization coming off of what happened last year. So to put it into a positive way, how I would define that, it has to be at the very minimum, getting to the championship series, getting to the World Series, even, winning it. Hard for me to actually let those words escape my mouth, but that would be a positive, a successful season for the Mets in 2026. But I could tell you what would be a failure, and that would be missing the playoffs here in 2026. And hopefully that will not be the case. And I do believe the moves they have done, the team they have assembled here, that will not be the case by the time we are in October of this year.
I'll tell you what, Tony, I'm saying if, Mets fans, if they miss the playoffs, that's not going to be good. Some people are not going to be here. That's what I'll say. If that happens, there'll be some people that will not be back in the Mets organization. There'll be a lot of changes. That's what I will say. Yeah, success, they got to make the playoffs. I think that's step one. Beyond that, could this team get to the NLCS? Sure. I think they could. If things break right, could they get to the World Series? Sure. Could they win the World Series? Anything's possible. It's been 40 years since the Mets have won a World Series, right? It's been a long time. A lot of people would like to see it. I know you would like to see it, Tony, but we'll see. But listen, this has been a roller coaster of an offseason. I will say that. It's been very up and down. It's been fun to cover and watch. And now we'll see in a couple weeks as spring training starts. We'll see how things go with the Mets. Everybody, that is my guy, Tony Metro. Check him out. Great YouTube channel. Plenty of Mets content. Go give him a follow. Hit that like and subscribe button on his YouTube channel. I've had a pleasure of being on his show. Tony, you'll be back here on Straight Outta Flushing, I'm sure, many more times through the season. So I appreciate you, my friend, and we'll definitely do this again soon.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, and looking forward to what will hopefully be a great Mets season.
We can only hope that it will be a great Mets season. Once again, go support my guy, Tony Metro. I'm Dexter Henry, signing off on this edition of Straight Outta Flushing.